In 1993, Nigerians voted overwhelmingly for MKO Abiola. It was the most credible election result this country had ever produced. The turnout was real, the mandate was clear, the man was ready, and they were right to vote for him. And it destroyed us anyway. Now, while every political commentator in Nigeria today is debating whether Peter Obi can win in 2027, almost nobody is asking the question that actually matters. Not whether he can win, but what happens to Nigeria if he does. Because here is what history keeps trying to tell us, and what we keep refusing to hear. In Nigeria, the presidency is not the solution. The presidency is the trap. Stay with me. Before we go further, if you are new here, Naija Update 24/7 exists for one reason: to give every Nigerian, wherever you are, whatever region you are from, the political analysis that mainstream media won't touch. Hit subscribe and stay with me. This gets deeper. Let us begin with what is actually happening and why we are having this conversation right now. Peter Obi's Labour Party movement stunned analysts in the 2023 election. It mobilized a generation of first-time voters that the legacy parties had written off, particularly in the southeast, in Lagos, and among Nigerian youth across every region of this country. Obi himself has not publicly declared for 2027, but Labour Party structures are quietly being rebuilt, diaspora networks are being reactivated, and polling conversations have resumed in Abuja and in living rooms across Nigeria and beyond. At the same time, three conditions are converging simultaneously that make this analysis urgent right now. The Tinubu administration's economic reforms, subsidy removal, naira devaluation, have produced a cost of living crisis that is radicalizing middle-class opinion faster than any opposition campaign ever could on its own. The obedient movement has not dissolved, its digital infrastructure is still active, and its emotional investment is still alive. And the 2027 electoral calendar means that serious candidate positioning has to begin in earnest very soon, which means this is the exact moment to stop debating whether Obi can win and start asking what winning actually produces. Because every major Nigerian opposition figure who finally reached power, from Obasanjo in 1999 to Buhari in 2015, arrived carrying enormous public expectation. Both were eventually judged to have underperformed. And the critical point that Nigerian political commentary consistently misses is this: their underperformance was not primarily because of personal failure. It was because of the structural conditions of Nigerian governance consumed them. This is not an observation about those men as individuals. It is an observation about the system they entered, the same system that will be waiting for Peter Obi on day one. So let us examine that system honestly. Let us look at the constitutional architecture that any incoming president inherits. Nigeria's 1999 constitution concentrates enormous formal power in the executive. On paper, the president looks powerful, but in practice, that power is functionally hollow without three things: legislative cooperation, state governors' support, and party machinery. And right now, Peter Obi has reliable access to none of those three. Start with the legislature. In 2023, Labour Party won 35 seats in the House and 8 seats in the Senate out of 469 total positions. If Peter Obi wins the presidency in 2027, he would walk into Aso Rock facing a legislature still dominated by APC and PDP structures. These are men and women who have spent decades building transactional political networks. A reform-minded executive would immediately threaten those networks, and every budget, every executive bill, every constitutional amendment requires that legislature. This is not a solvable problem by goodwill. You cannot charm a patronage system into dismantling itself. Then consider the governors. Nigeria's federal structure gives state governors extraordinary autonomous power. They control state-level security operations, their own courts, local government elections, and critically, their own political machines. Of Nigeria's 36 governors, almost none ran on Labour Party tickets. A Peter Obi presidency would have to negotiate, cajole, or compete with governors who owe him nothing, who answer to different party hierarchies, whose political survival does not depend on his success and may actually depend on his failure. And below the governors sits something even more resistant to change, the federal bureaucracy, the civil service, the parastatals, the revenue agencies. This is not an ideologically neutral system. It is a patronage ecosystem built over 60 years of Nigerian statehood. It does not reform quickly. It resists disruption from the top. It absorbs bold directives and dilutes them by the time they reach implementation. Any president who does not understand this walks in blind. Now, here is a fact that almost nobody in this conversation is discussing. Tinubu's most controversial reforms, subsidy removal, the Naira float, were not ideas that Tinubu invented. They were IMF and World Bank conditions that every previous administration, since Jonathan, refused to implement, not because they lacked the economics, but because they lacked the political cover. Peter Obi, who also supports fiscal discipline and economic liberalization, would face those exact same structural pressures and the same political backlash when he tried to implement them. The problem is not who holds the pen, it is what the pen is capable of writing against this institutional war. Now, let us look at who actually benefits and who actually loses in this political moment, because these questions have answers that cut much deeper than the surface-level debate. There is an important distinction to make first. Who benefits from a Peter Obi candidacy is a completely different question from who benefits from a Peter Obi presidency. Confusing those two questions is the source of most political miscalculation in Nigeria, and it is where a lot of well-meaning supporters make their most serious analytical errors.
The candidacy benefits are real and significant. Labour Party consolidating as a genuine third force option would permanently alter Nigeria's two-party duopoly in ways that would outlast any single election. Youth political mobilization, once activated at the scale we saw in 2023, becomes a permanent feature of the democratic landscape regardless of outcome. And the Obi candidacy gives southern political aspirations a credible champion who is operating outside the legacy party machinery for the first time in a generation. But who risks losing if Obi actually wins? The APC's northern political establishment loses the presidency, and with it the federal appointments, contracts, and patronage flows that sustain its coalition in the northwest and northeast. PDP governors who might prefer to benefit from the Obi wave without actually supporting him face a disruption to their own careful calculations. And the informal political economy, the middlemen, the contractors, the budget padding ecosystem that runs through every layer of federal spending faces a president who has publicly committed to fiscal transparency and who has a documented record in Anambra of actually attempting cost control. Now, this is where the analysis becomes genuinely complex. And this is where Naija Update 24/7 speaks for the whole country, not any single part of it. An Obi victory is not simply a southeast victory. His 2023 coalition included substantial Yoruba youth support in Lagos, meaningful Middle Belt sympathy, and a diaspora mobilization that cuts cleanly across ethnic lines. But his path to 2027 electoral victory almost certainly requires either peeling off significant northern votes, which faces real structural resistance, or running the table on southern and middle belt turnout to a degree that 2023, impressive as it was, did not achieve. Neither path is impossible, neither path is easy, and neither path automatically solves the governance problem that comes after. And here is the question I want you to hold in your mind as we continue. If Peter Obi builds a coalition broad enough to win, is that coalition governable? Can the same alliance that wins an election actually pass a budget, confirm a cabinet, and survive a midterm crisis? We will come back to that. There are also actors watching all of this who rarely appear in the public conversation. International creditors, the IMF, World Bank, bilateral lenders have structural positions on Nigerian fiscal policy that are entirely impersonal. They will work with whoever wins, but they will apply the same conditions to whoever wins, because those conditions are about the Nigerian economy, not about Nigerian personalities. The Nigerian business elite across all regions is not monolithic. Some have positioned investments to benefit from the current policy direction. Others see an Obi presidency as the opportunity to reset their access. And the military and security establishment, whose institutional interests cut across every party, watches any presidential transition carefully for signals about defense budgets, procurement priorities, and how the new administration intends to handle the multiple active security crises running simultaneously across Nigerian territory. Consider what history is telling us here. In 2015, Muhammadu Buhari won on an anti-corruption, fiscal discipline, and security platform. That platform was, in its broad strokes, strikingly similar to the platform Peter Obi ran on in 2023. The Nigerian electorate chose that message, and then chose it again. The structural results of both Buhari terms are now part of the historical record that all of us lived through. The lesson is not that anti-corruption is the wrong message. The lesson is that anti-corruption as a governing strategy requires institutional leverage that the Nigerian presidency, by deliberate constitutional design, does not possess alone. Now, if what I just told you surprises you, drop a comment below. I want to know what you think before we get to the part that changes everything. Let us talk about what an Obi presidency would mean for ordinary Nigerians, not in campaign language, in honest structural terms. An Obi presidency does not automatically translate to Labour Party governance at the state level. The 36 states, with their own budgets, their own internal economies, their own security configurations, would largely continue operating under APC and PDP governors. Federal policy directives would have to travel through administrative structures that belong to political opponents. This is not theoretically impossible, but it is historically very, very hard. Every administration that has tried to push federal reform through hostile state structures has learned this the painful way. The economic picture for ordinary Nigerians is similarly uncomfortable when you look at it honestly. The problems Nigeria faces, declining oil revenue, infrastructure deficit, manufacturing underdevelopment, food insecurity, youth unemployment, are structural. They predate the Tinubu administration. They predate the Buhari administration. They will outlast any incoming administration without deep institutional reform. Obi could attempt those reforms, but reforms require legislative approval, state-level cooperation, and time measured in years, not months. The Nigerians who are suffering right now, paying these prices, living with this power situation, watching their savings erode, would be asked to wait again, believing in a process that the system has repeatedly frustrated across their lifetimes. There is also a dimension of this conversation that requires honesty, even when honesty is uncomfortable. An Obi presidency, as a Christian Igbo man, would need to navigate the informal rotation expectations that have structured Nigerian presidential succession since 1999. A significant segment of northern political opinion, not all, but large enough to be consequential, views the presidency as a resource to be shared geographically and religiously. This is not a legally valid framework. It is not a fair framework, but it is a real political force. Managing it would consume enormous political capital before a single policy was implemented. That is not a reason to say Obi should not run. It is a reason to be honest about the energy that governing would require before the governance even begins.
On security, and this is not discussed enough, the Northwest banditry crisis, the Northeast insurgency residual, the Southeast security situation, and the South-South militancy potential all require federal executive engagement that goes far beyond political will and presidential declarations. They require security architecture, fiscal resources, and critically, the active cooperation of state governors who control the complementary security levers at the local level. A president whose political coalition does not include those governors faces a harder security management challenge, not because of his character, because of how the system routes cooperation or withholds it. Now, let us look briefly at how this reads from outside Nigeria's borders, because the international dimension matters, and particularly for the millions of Nigerians in the diaspora whose support drove so much of the obedient movement's momentum. Western governments, the United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union evaluate Nigerian presidential leadership primarily through the lens of political stability, debt management, and counter-terrorism cooperation. They have no formal preference for any candidate, but they have institutional memory of how Nigerian presidential transitions have been managed, and they watch carefully for signals about continuity in security posture and economic policy direction.
Peter Obi's international profile is genuinely positive in Western diplomatic and investor circles. His business background and the credibility of his 2023 campaign made him legible to foreign audiences in a way that many Nigerian politicians are not. But here is what investor communities watch more carefully than personal reputation. They watch whether an incoming government can actually pass its policies through a resistant legislature before they commit capital. Credibility in Abuja's corridors of power matters more to a foreign investor than credibility on an international panel. For Nigerians in the UK, the US, Canada, and across Europe, many of whom were at the center of the obedient movement's digital and financial infrastructure, a Peter Obi presidency would represent a profound emotional validation. That is real, and it is not nothing, but the practical diaspora investment questions are structural. Will remittance channels be improved? Will the Naira find stability? Will dual citizenship rights finally be clarified and protected? These are legislative and regulatory questions. The presidency alone cannot resolve them. The same National Assembly that would resist Obi's domestic agenda would have to pass the enabling legislation that diaspora Nigerians need. And here is where the open question I raised earlier finds its answer. I asked whether the coalition broad enough to win is actually governable. Even a highly competent Nigerian president with strong diaspora support and positive relationships with Western governments is still, every single day, negotiating with a National Assembly he does not control, 36 governors who owe him nothing, and a patronage system that does not reform simply because someone new sits in Aso Rock. The coalition that wins the election and the coalition that governs Nigeria are not the same thing. In the history of this republic, they never have been. Now, let us be fair. Let us take the counter-arguments seriously, because they deserve to be taken seriously. The first argument, Obi's track record in Anambra proves that he can govern differently. This is a serious argument, and it deserves a serious response. Obi did demonstrate genuine fiscal prudence as governor. He saved funds, reduced waste, and delivered infrastructure within real resource constraints. His record there is not fiction, it is documented. But the counterpoint is not that he cannot govern. It is that state-level governance and federal governance in Nigeria involve categorically different scales of institutional complexity, political opposition, and structural constraint. The Federation account, the National Assembly, the 36 governors, the security architecture, the multilateral debt obligations, none of these existed in Anambra governorship. That record is evidence of character. It is not a rehearsal for the federal stage. The second argument, the alternative, continuing with APC or PDP, is definitely worse. This argument carries real emotional force, but definitely worse is a political claim, not a governance analysis. The question is not whether the status quo is acceptable. It clearly is not. The question is whether electoral change alone produces governance change, or whether something deeper must shift at the same time for any new administration to succeed where the previous ones have fallen short. The third argument, Nigerians need to try something different. The experiment must be made. This may ultimately be correct. Democratic evolution requires testing new coalitions. Labour Party's growth as an institution, regardless of what happens in 2027, is genuinely significant for Nigeria's long-term political development. A viable third party changes the incentive structures of the legacy parties. That is valuable even before a single election is decided. But here is the sharpest misconception in this entire debate, and it is the one that most needs to be said clearly. People assume that the obstacle to good governance in Nigeria is the wrong person sitting in Aso Rock. But what if the obstacle is Aso Rock itself? What if it is the concentrated, patron-dependent, institutionally resistant system that surrounds whoever sits in that chair? If that is true, and the evidence across 6 administrations suggests it might be, then the path to better governance does not run only through winning an election. It runs through constitutional reform, National Assembly restructuring, meaningful fiscal federalism, and deep civil service reform. These are things that require years of deliberate political work that must begin before an election is won, not after the euphoria of winning has faded. What every Nigerian shares, regardless of region, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of religion, is a stake in governance that actually delivers security, economic opportunity, education for children, infrastructure that works. That outcome is not secured by winning an election. It is built painstakingly through institutional reform that survives beyond any single presidency.
Every Nigerian, Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, Fulani, Ijaw, Tiv, Kanuri, Efik needs that outcome. The question of who wins 2027 matters, but the question of what winning actually produces matters more.
So what happens next? What should you watch for between now and 2027? Labour Party faces a strategic decision that will determine whether it becomes a governing institution or remains a protest movement. It needs to decide whether 2027 is a presidential-first strategy or a National Assembly-first strategy. Building genuine legislative capacity before the presidential race is the only logical path to actual governability. Watch whether Labour Party contests governorship races aggressively in 2026 state elections. That will tell you whether the party is building for power or building for a campaign. APC will attempt to fracture the obedient coalition along ethnic and regional lines, the same playbook that has worked in previous cycles. Watch for targeted appeals to Middle Belt and Northern youth that mirror Obi's economic messaging while anchoring on security and religious identity. The fracture strategy is not guaranteed to work, but it is coming and it will be sophisticated. PDP is in internal reconstruction mode. Watch whether the party can reconsolidate around a northern candidate credible enough to reclaim the former PDP states that both Tinubu and Obi competed for in 2023. A credible PDP northern candidate changes the election mathematics significantly. Watch the Tinubu administration carefully on 3 specific indicators: inflation, Naira stability, and electricity. Any meaningful improvement that ordinary Nigerians can feel, not press release improvement, but lived improvement, before 2027 changes the incumbency calculus substantially. If 2 of those 3 move in the right direction, the political ground shifts again. And above all else, watch for this: whether any significant northern political figure, a governor, a sitting senator, a former minister with a genuine constituency base, publicly and substantively aligns with Peter Obi. That single signal, more than any other, would confirm that a genuine national coalition is being assembled rather than assumed. At the opening of this video, I told you about 1993, that Nigerians made the right choice and it destroyed us anyway. I want to be precise about what that lesson actually means. The lesson of 1993 is not that elections don't matter. They matter enormously. The lesson is that Nigeria's deepest problems are institutional, and they require institutional solutions that survive elections, solutions that are built into structures, not carried solely in the character of a single man. Peter Obi may be exactly what his supporters believe he is: a disciplined, competent, honest, nationally minded leader. That entire analysis may be correct, and it may still not be sufficient, not because of any failure on his part, but because of what the Nigerian state does to anyone who enters it without institutional foundations already in place, in the legislature, in the governor's offices, in the security apparatus, and deep in the civil service. The question Nigerians should be asking in 2027 is not just whether Peter Obi can win, it is whether the ground has been prepared for anyone to actually govern. That is the harder question. That is the more important question, and that is the conversation this country needs. If this analysis gave you clarity, share it with one Nigerian who needs to understand what is really happening. Like, subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Naija Update 24/7. We never stop watching.